And I'm sure that some of you have heard about this lad here up on the screen. A guy called Austin Appleby. He's a 13-year-old boy who rescued his family in what is being called a superhuman feat. Last month, he and his mum and his 2 younger siblings were out kayaking and paddleboarding in a place called Geograph Bay in Australia. But soon the waves grew, flipping over their boards and filling their kayak with water. And they were getting dragged further and further out into the ocean. And that's when young Austin decided to swim the 4 kilometres to shore to raise the alarm. So after 4 hours of battling the current and swimming, he finally managed to get to the shore, called the emergency services, who eventually found the rest of his family clinging to a paddleboard, drifting 14 kilometres out into the ocean. Austin's family were saved through his incredible determination and courage. That's a good Mother's Day present, isn't it? I don't think any of us are ever going to match that. So this boy has incredible determination, incredible courage. But sometimes, even that is not enough. Living for Christ can feel a little bit like that we're swimming in the middle of an ocean. That we're battling the winds and waves of temptation, of doubt, of opposition, of pain, of suffering. Desperately trying to get to the shore. And even with all of the determination and courage that we can stir up within us, it still feels impossible. But the good news is that Daniel chapter 10 reminds us that we're not on our own. And we don't need to depend on our own resources. We can depend on God's strength in this world of suffering. So we're going to read this wonderful chapter, Daniel chapter 10, verse 1 through 21, and Joel is going to come and he's going to read it for us this morning. Thanks, Joel.
So, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for 3 full weeks. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sounds of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to me, for I was left with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what it is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come. When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face towards the ground and was mute. And behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke. And I said to him who stood before me, O my Lord, by reason of the vision pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me. Again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you, be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak for me, you have strengthened me. Then he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince.
Thanks, Joel. This was Daniel's third and final vision of his book. The details of the vision are in chapters 11 and 12, and we're going to look at that next week as we kind of try and finish up with the book of Daniel. But here we're just given a summary of that vision. Look at verse 1. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. Daniel received this vision about 536 BC, before Jesus, when some of the Jewish exiles had already returned to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they'd already started to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But this did not mean that Israel was going to enjoy her newfound freedom and peace for long. The vision described in incredible detail the political conspiracies and the massive conflicts that were going to happen in the next hundreds of years. And they were primarily associated with the Greek empires of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. But Daniel was told that the focus of this vision was what will happen to your people in the future. Verse 14. It was all about how the people of Israel, the Jews, were going to suffer greatly. And of course, we too are living in a world full of conflict, aren't we? The war in Iran is very much in all of our minds, but we mustn't forget the war in Gaza, or in Ukraine, or Myanmar, or Somalia, or Sudan, or Nigeria, and the list just goes on and on and on. And of course, God's people are not spared from this conflict. Many Christians are under violent and physical attack today. We're very fortunate, very blessed that we have the freedom to come and to gather in safety this morning. But that doesn't mean that we don't suffer. Because opposition and rejection and persecution are part of all of our Christian lives. This is what Jesus promised. In this world, you will have trouble. John 16:33. The reality for all of us is that we live in this world with great conflict. And that can have a huge impact on us. This vision deeply troubled Daniel. Have a look at verse 2. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. And of course, this was not the first revelation that Daniel had received of future suffering for his people. If you've been with us through the book of Daniel, you'll remember chapter 7, how he was told about those 4 great empires that would rise and fall. Then chapter 8, how that vision focused in on the reigns of the second and third of those empires. And the violence and the conflict associated with them. And then last week in chapter 9, we learned about how there would be 70 sevens, 490 years decreed before they'd see God fully deal with sin and reign supremely in their lives. So Daniel had heard all of this before, in a sense, but he hadn't hardened his heart to it. Daniel still had a soft heart. A heart that could be broken with compassion and care for his people. And he was willing to allow that grief to impact his emotions, his diet, and his lifestyle. I think this reminds us of Paul, the Apostle Paul. Remember what he said in Romans chapter 9? I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers. And both Daniel and Paul are reflecting God's heart. That's why Paul told us to pray for everyone. He said, this is good and pleases God, our Saviour, who wants all men to be saved. So although it hurts, God wants us to have a soft heart in this world full of suffering. To care. To be moved with love. To grieve over the mess around us. And to long for people to be saved. When we watch all of those things on the news or on the internet, it should impact our hearts. It should cause deep sadness in our hearts. But it shouldn't stop with that. Later, the angel told Daniel in verse 12, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that Daniel, yes, he was grieving for these 3 weeks, but he wasn't just grieving. He wasn't just sad. He was praying for those 3 weeks. He was seeking the Lord. He was asking for help to understand what he'd been shown. He was humbling himself before the Lord. Now, I guess that most of us aren't surprised at that, knowing what we know about Daniel. As a young man, remember how he asked God for help to understand the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, his dream? Then as an older man, Daniel was committed to pray, even if it cost him his life, being thrown to the lions. And then as a concerned man, praying for repentance and restoration for his people and his nation and his city. Daniel was a man of prayer. So he wasn't just overwhelmed with the suffering around him in this world. He took that sadness to the Lord and humbly asked for help. And that is how we should respond when we are overwhelmed by our pain, or by the pain of those that are loved ones, or when we just look out at the world and are distressed by all that is happening around us. Yes, we shall allow it to break our hearts. But not just that. It should also lead us to turn in prayer. To cast all our anxieties on the Lord. To pour out our hearts to the Lord. Because as Jason already reminded us this morning, God is our refuge and strength. An ever-present help in trouble. And when we do that, when we do respond to the suffering, the great suffering in our world by praying, then we can be confident that God will hear our prayers and that He'll answer them. That's what he did for Daniel. With a great vision. Daniel was standing on the bank of this river, the river Tigris, when he saw this. Verse 5. He saw a man dressed in linen, with a belt of finest gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, with his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. The appearance of this man was so incredible, so amazing, that Daniel was just devastated by it. Verse 8, my face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. And when he spoke, Daniel fell face down, prostrate before him. Even Daniel's companions who were with him, they didn't see the man, they didn't see the vision, but even the whole impact of this meant that they were overwhelmed with terror. So who was this man? And why did he appear to Daniel in this way? Well, like much of the book of Daniel, there is a bit of a debate about the answer to this. Some think that this man standing here is actually a pre-incarnate, a pre-Bethlehem appearance of Christ. Especially as is described in similar ways to how John described Jesus when he saw him on the Isle of Patmos in Revelation 1. If you have a chance to look at it, you'll see the similarities between those two descriptions. That might be right, but I think it's probably more likely that this person was an angel. One of God's messengers. And in a way, I think that's even more incredible when you think of it. Because if this is just how one of God's messengers appear, if the glory and the majesty of this man standing before Daniel is just a poor reflection of the true glory of God, then how much more awesome is the God that we serve? And I think that probably explains why this angel appeared to Daniel in this way. Angels throughout the Bible appear to people in all sorts of ways, sometimes in ways that didn't seem really that supernatural. And you think, is that an angel or is that a person? But I think this is why this angel appeared to Daniel in this way. Daniel was struggling with the revelation of the suffering of his people. So he didn't just need an explanation of this vision. The angel gave that to him later on. But he also needed a fresh understanding of the power and the might of the one who is in charge of it all. He needed a fresh vision of God. He needed to see that as great as the problems in the world were, his God was greater. As powerful as God's enemies were, his God is stronger. As impossible as his situation appeared, he needed to be able to say to God, nothing is impossible. Nothing is too hard for you. That's what we need too, isn't it? Often our struggle in our lives is not because our problems are too big. It's because our view of God is too small. So what we need is to open our eyes again to the awesomeness of our God. See him seated high and lifted up on the throne, reigning in power, sovereign over everything. Now, of course, we've probably not had an angelic vision like Daniel had to teach us this. But we have had something far better. This is what John wrote. John chapter 1. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Jesus is better than any angel. He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. So when we're struggling with the suffering and pain in our world, what do we need to do? We need to fix our eyes on Jesus. Rest in all that he reveals to us about God's sovereign majesty and wisdom and power and grace and love. We need to just keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. But if this angel came in response to Daniel's prayer, why did it take him 3 weeks to get there? Well, the angel explained that this was because of a great struggle. Look at verse 13. The prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Now, the Bible doesn't give us all the answers to the questions that we might have about the angelic world, the angelic beings, good and bad. But it does tell us that that heavenly realm is very real and very powerful. So the prince of Persia is probably, most people think, is an evil spirit, assigned by Satan to some kind of authority over the kingdom of Persia at that time. And it seems to be an imitation of God's assignment of his angels to specific roles in this world. As the devil often does, he tries to counterfeit what God does. Because the angel that helped this angel that is talking to Daniel was an angel called Michael, who's described as the great prince who protects your people. He is the archangel focusing on the protection of the people of Israel. So we have the prince of Persia who has an influence on the kingdom of Persia in an evil sense, and you have Michael who's protecting God's people. So the kingdoms and the governments of this world are in some way under the influence of unseen evil powers. There is more going on in this world than we can see. In fact, there was an angelic war that happened in response to Daniel's prayer. He had no idea about it for 3 weeks until he was told about it here. Now, we need to be careful with this. It does not mean that we should try to investigate or obsess over these demonic forces. There are some people who are tempted to do that. Paul warned the Colossians about people who were doing that in his day. False teachers who were overly focused on angels and angelic beings. He says this: such a person goes into great detail about what he has seen, and his unspiritual mind puffs him up with idle notions. He has lost connection with the head. Our focus should not be on angels and demons and all that kind of stuff. Our focus is supposed to be on Jesus. We're supposed to obsess about him. We're supposed to depend on him, trust in him, worship him. So we don't be obsessed about this. But this is another reminder that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And if that is the case, then we need to go in to fight this battle with spiritual weapons, We can't just see this as a human conflict. Each day of our lives, we need to put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. But all of this that had just happened to Daniel was just too much for him. The vision, the angel, the insight into the spiritual conflict. As a result of it all, Daniel was just done. This elderly man in his 80s, he'd been grieving for 3 weeks on a very limited diet. Then he was lying on his face, helpless before this angel. Then he was up on his hands and his knees, trembling. Then he was speechless. And finally he said this, verse 17. My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. It was all too much for him. He was at the end of his resources. His strength had gone. His heart and mind and body just couldn't take any more. He couldn't cope with what God had called him to do in receiving this vision. It's too much. Can't do it. But at that moment, this terrifying, powerful angel reached out his hand and for the third time in this passage touched Daniel and gave him strength. Look at verse 19. The angel said, do not be afraid, O man highly esteemed. Peace. Be strong now. Be strong. What a great encouragement for Daniel. He didn't need to be overwhelmed with fear or exhaustion. Instead, because he was highly esteemed, or as Joel's translation said, greatly loved, he could experience peace and strength. Because God would provide all that he needed to do all that God had called him to do. And that's what happened. Verse 19, Daniel wrote, When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. Something similar happened to the Apostle John when he met the risen Lord on the island of Patmos. Overwhelmed, John fell face down. But Jesus touched him and said, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. And this is the encouragement for all of us who have trusted in Jesus. Yes, God might call us to go through some really difficult times, to serve Him in ways that are beyond what we can cope with, beyond what we can do. But He doesn't leave us to our own devices. When He calls, He also equips and energizes and encourages and empowers. And we can be sure of this because of His sacrificial death and His glorious resurrection. Romans chapter 5 verse 6 says this: At just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Jesus didn't wait for us to sort ourselves out, to clean up our act, to start seeking for Him. Instead, when we were still lost in our sin, dead in our transgressions, objects of wrath, Jesus laid down his life for us. He stepped into our weakness and our inability so that we could receive the righteousness that we could never earn for ourselves. So the salvation that we needed from Jesus was provided completely by God's grace. And so we can be sure that the strength that we need to live for Jesus will also be provided completely by God's grace. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. This does not make our lives easy. There still will be times of great conflict when we feel that we cannot keep on going. And it might break our hearts when we see all of that. But we can respond, have that great response of praying to the Lord. Fixing our eyes on Jesus as He reveals to us the greatness of our God. Remembering that there's a spiritual struggle going on that we just cannot see. But trusting that no matter how difficult it gets, we can keep on living for Jesus. Depending on the great encouragement and strength that He can give us. Because His grace is sufficient for us.